Before I tell you what my husband did, I need you to understand who I was before him and who I became because of him. Because betrayal doesn't land the same way when you've given everything. It doesn't cut the same when you've built the life someone else stood on. I was never reckless with love. I didn't rush into marriage chasing fantasy or romance. I believed love was something you worked at, something you protected, something you showed up for even when nobody was watching. I believed marriage was partnership. I met my husband when his life was still unfinished. He was smart, yes, but uncertain, ambitious, but unanchored. He had dreams that lived in his head but hadn't yet found their way into the real world, and I saw him. I didn't just see who he was, I saw who he could become. That's the dangerous thing about loving deeply. You don't just love what's in front of you, you love the future you imagine together. When he talked about going back to school, people around him were skeptical. Graduate school wasn't cheap. The workload was heavy. The path was long. But I didn't hesitate. I said, "We'll figure it out." Those words would shape the next decade of my life. I worked longer hours. I adjusted my spending. I postponed my own dreams so his could move forward uninterrupted. I became practical where he was idealistic, stable where he was unsure. While he studied, I carried the weight of the household, rent, groceries, utilities, insurance, emergencies. I didn't complain. I didn't keep score. At night, when I should have been resting, I sat beside him as he stressed over deadlines, comprehensive exams, committee approvals. I proofread papers I barely understood. I listened to him rehearse presentations again and again because he needed reassurance. I became his quiet strength. When he doubted himself, I reminded him who he was. When he wanted to quit, I reminded him why he started. When he felt small, I made him feel capable. Let me ask you something, and I want you to pause and think before answering in the comments. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that their success felt like your responsibility? Because that's where I lived. I didn't see myself as sacrificing. I saw myself as investing, building, contributing to something larger than myself. When he completed his master's degree, I cried harder than he did. Not because of the diploma, but because I remembered every night we stayed up late, every bill I paid quietly, every time I chose patience over resentment. And when he said he wanted to pursue a PhD, I swallowed my fear and said yes again. Another long road, another season of holding things together, another chapter of my life rearranged around his future. People don't talk enough about the kind of labor women do behind the scenes. The emotional labor, the invisible labor, the labor that doesn't get certificates or applause, but it matters. Because when he finally walked across that stage with doctor attached to his name, everyone celebrated him. They shook his hand. They praised his intelligence. They admired his discipline. No one asked who paid the price when he couldn't. No one asked who carried the load while he climbed. That part stayed invisible. And here's the truth, I didn't resent that. I was proud. I believed we had done something together, that this was our accomplishment, that this was the reward for patience, loyalty, and teamwork. I believed marriage was supposed to work that way. Let me ask you something else, and be honest with yourself. What does it do to your heart when you realize you were the only one protecting the marriage? Because that realization doesn't come suddenly, it comes slowly. In small moments you brush off. In instincts you ignore because love teaches you to trust. In boundaries that blur quietly right under your nose. I trusted him. I trusted my family. And that trust made me vulnerable in ways I didn't yet understand. I didn't know then that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers or outsiders. Sometimes it grows inside your own home, inside your own bloodline, inside the spaces you never thought to guard. I didn't know that the same woman who shared my childhood memories would one day be part of my deepest pain. I didn't know that everything I built with love would one day feel like evidence against me. Proof of how much I gave to people who didn't protect me the same way. And that's what makes this story so heavy. Because the affair wasn't the first betrayal. The first betrayal was believing that loyalty was mutual. And I didn't see it yet. But I was about to. The first thing you need to understand about betrayal is that it rarely arrives loudly. It doesn't crash through the door announcing itself. It settles in slowly, wearing the face of normalcy. It starts with trust. My sister had always been part of my life. She was blood, history, shared memories. The person who knew where I came from before I learned who I was. When she started spending more time around us, I didn't question it. Why would I? Family helps family. That's what I was taught. She came around under reasonable circumstances at first, needing a place to stay for a few days, then a few weeks, transitions, hard times. I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't draw lines. I thought love didn't need boundaries. That was my mistake. At the time, my husband was deep into his doctoral program. Long hours, stress, pressure. I told myself he needed support, stability, calm. I was working full time, holding the household together, making sure the wheels didn't come off while he focused on finishing strong. And my sister was there. At first, it felt helpful. She cooked sometimes. She kept him company when I worked late. She listened to him talk about school, the same stories I had heard 100 times. I didn't feel threatened. Why would I? That's my sister. But something shifted, not suddenly, subtly. I noticed how comfortable they became around each other, how conversation flowed a little too easily, how they shared inside jokes I wasn't part of. I noticed how he mentioned her more often when she wasn't around, how he defended her unnecessarily when there was nothing to defend. I noticed how she started dressing differently at home, not inappropriate, just intentional. I noticed how they avoided eye contact when I walked into a room. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever ignored your instincts because you didn't want to believe what they were telling you? Because that's what I did. I told myself I was tired, overworked, sensitive. I blamed stress before I blamed reality. I told myself trust was a virtue, but trust without boundaries is vulnerability waiting to be exploited. There were moments, small ones, that should have stopped me in my tracks. A laugh that lingered too long. A conversation that ended abruptly when I entered. A look that didn't belong between a husband and a sister-in-law. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to accuse anyone of something so unthinkable because once you speak it out loud, you can't take it back. And I wasn't ready to live in a world where my husband and my sister could do something like that to me. So I stayed silent, I stayed polite, I stayed trusting, and slowly I became invisible in my own home. I noticed how my husband began pulling away from me emotionally. how conversations felt rushed, how affection became mechanical. I told myself it was the pressure of his program. I made excuses for him the way I always had. I carried his stress so he wouldn't have to. Meanwhile, the emotional intimacy he used to share with me was being redirected. And I didn't know how to compete with someone who shared my blood. Let me ask you another question, and this one may sting. How do you confront betrayal when it wears the faces of the people you love most? Because confronting them would have meant accepting that two people I trusted deeply were capable of hurting me in the same breath. That realization takes courage, and I didn't have it yet. One night, I woke up and realized my husband wasn't in bed. I found him in the kitchen, sitting across from my sister, talking quietly, laughing softly. The house was still, too still. And in that moment, something in my chest tightened. Not suspicion, recognition. I didn't accuse, I didn't confront, I just watched. Because part of me already knew. I just wasn't ready to admit it. That's the cruelest part of betrayal, the knowing that comes before proof. The way your body understands before your mind allows it. And by the time the truth arrived, it wouldn't feel shocking. It would feel confirming. There's a moment when suspicion turns into certainty. Not because someone confesses, not because evidence falls into your lap, but because your body finally refuses to carry denial anymore. For me, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments. A change in the air, a heaviness in the house, a silence that felt intentional. I started noticing how my sister avoided me, how she moved through rooms like she was trying not to be seen, how conversations with her felt guarded, rehearsed. And my husband, the man I had built my life around, had grown distant in a way that no amount of stress could explain. I asked him if he was okay. He said he was tired. I asked him if something was wrong between us. He said I was imagining things, and that hurt more than I expected. Because when someone who owes you honesty chooses dismissal instead, it creates a crack that doesn't heal. Let me ask you something, and this one isn't easy. Have you ever been made to feel irrational for sensing the truth? That's what gaslighting looks like when it's subtle, not cruel, just quiet enough to make you doubt yourself. Weeks passed, and then one morning my sister didn't come down for breakfast. I found her in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub, pale and shaking. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She said she wasn't feeling well, and suddenly everything slowed down. I noticed her hands, her breathing, the way she kept swallowing, like she was holding something back. I asked her if she was sick. She shook her head. I asked her if she needed a doctor. She shook her head again, and then, barely audible, she said she was pregnant. The room went quiet. I remember staring at her, waiting for more information, waiting for a sentence that would make this make sense. I asked who the father was. She didn't answer. I asked again. She looked at the floor, and in that silence, my life split in two. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even move because shock doesn't look like movies make it look. Shock feels like being removed from your body. I knew before she said it, but hearing it confirmed felt like a physical injury. She said my husband's name, and everything I had been holding together collapsed at once. Let me pause here and ask you, because this matters. What do you do when betrayal comes from two directions at the same time? Because there is no instinct for that. Your mind can't prioritize which loss to process first. Marriage, family, trust, identity, all gone in the same breath. I confronted him that night. I didn't plan the conversation. I didn't rehearse my words. I just stood in front of him and asked one question. Is it true? He didn't deny it. That hurt more than a lie would have, because denial would have meant he cared enough to protect me from the truth. Instead, he sat down like a man exhausted by secrecy. He said it just happened. He said he never meant for it to go this far. He said it didn't mean anything, and I remember thinking, how can something that destroyed my entire life mean nothing to you? I asked him how long. He told me. I asked him how he could. He didn't have an answer. I asked him if he loved her. He said he didn't know. That was the moment my marriage ended. Not because of the pregnancy, but because he no longer spoke with clarity or responsibility. He spoke like a man relieved to stop pretending. I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I didn't ask him to choose because something inside me had gone very still. Let me ask you something, especially if you've ever been betrayed. Have you ever felt your heart shut down, not in anger, but in self-protection? That's what happened to me. I realized I had spent years protecting everyone else, and no one had protected me. I moved out shortly after, not because I had a plan, but because staying felt like self-erasure. I didn't know how to explain to people why my marriage ended. I didn't know how to explain that my sister was pregnant by my husband without feeling like I was telling someone else's nightmare. So I said nothing. I carried the weight alone. I grieved a marriage. I grieved a sister. I grieved the future I had built with my own hands. And the worst part, I questioned myself. I wondered if I had failed somewhere, if I had been too focused on his success, too accommodating, too trusting. I replayed years of my life, searching for the moment I could have stopped this. That kind of self-blame is a dangerous place because betrayal convinces you that your kindness was the mistake, and that lie takes years to unlearn. After the truth came out, life didn't explode the way people imagine it does. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting matches that brought relief, no moment where everything spilled out and then somehow made sense. What came instead was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over your life and changes how you breathe. People found out in pieces, whispers, carefully worded phone calls, half-truths told to avoid discomfort. I didn't announce what happened. I didn't make a spectacle of it. I didn't want sympathy that came with curiosity. So when people asked why my marriage ended, I said things like, it just didn't work, or we grew apart. And they nodded, relieved not to hear something ugly. But the ugliness didn't disappear just because I didn't say it out loud. It lived with me in grocery store aisles where I ran into people who knew my sister, in church pews where I felt eyes linger just a little too long, in family gatherings that stopped happening altogether. My family fractured in ways I never expected. Some people chose silence over truth. Others chose proximity over accountability. And that hurt in its own quiet way, because betrayal doesn't end with the people who committed it. It ripples outward, touching everyone who decides how much of the truth they're willing to carry. Let me ask you something, and this may be uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed how often the person who is hurt is expected to be the most graceful? I was expected to be calm, to be mature, to understand. I was told things like, they didn't mean to hurt you, and it's complicated, and you don't want to tear the family apart, as if the family hadn't already been torn, as if my pain was something that needed to be managed for everyone else's comfort. I stopped attending events. I stopped answering certain calls. I learned who needed distance and who needed silence. And in that isolation, something strange happened. Without realizing it, I started shrinking. I measured my words. I softened my presence. I apologized for existing in rooms where my pain made others uneasy. Shame does that, not because you did something wrong, but because something wrong was done to you and the world doesn't know what to do with it. I carried shame that wasn't mine. I felt embarrassed by the story, even though I hadn't betrayed anyone. And some days, that weight was heavier than the loss itself. I questioned my worth, not in obvious ways, in subtle ones. I wondered if I had been too focused on his success, if I had neglected my own needs, if I had made myself too available, too reliable, too easy to take for granted. I wondered if loving someone through their hardest years had somehow made me less valuable in their eyes. Let me ask you something, especially if you've ever given everything to someone. When your sacrifices are repaid with betrayal, how do you stop seeing yourself as disposable? That question followed me everywhere. I had to rebuild my identity without the roles I had defined myself by. I wasn't his support system anymore. I wasn't part of a unit. I wasn't the woman behind the success story. I was just me, and I didn't know who that was yet. So I started small. I focused on routine, on stability, on getting through days without collapsing under the weight of what had happened. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt like an accomplishment. Other days, anger surged out of nowhere, not loud, not explosive, but deep and hot, sitting behind my ribs. I learned that grief isn't linear. Some days I missed the man I thought I married. Some days I missed the sister I thought I had. Some days I missed the version of myself who still believed love was always safe. And some days I felt nothing at all. Emotional numbness is rarely talked about, but it's real. It's the mind's way of giving you a break when feeling everything would be too much. During those years, I became fiercely independent, not because I wanted to be, but because I had no other choice. I made decisions alone. I carried my own disappointments. I learned how to sit with myself without distraction. Slowly, without noticing, something began to shift. I stopped blaming myself. I began to see my past actions not as foolishness, but as generosity. I wasn't naive. I was loyal. I wasn't weak. I was committed. I wasn't blind. I was trusting. Those are not flaws. They only become dangerous when offered to the wrong people. Let me pause here and ask you, because this matters. Have you ever had to reclaim qualities you were taught to be ashamed of after someone betrayed you? That reclamation takes time. It takes unlearning. It takes choosing not to let someone else's moral failure rewrite your character. I began to see myself again, not as a woman defined by betrayal, but as someone who had survived it without becoming cruel. And that realization mattered because I was still standing and I was no longer willing to disappear to make others comfortable. For a long time, I thought healing meant getting over it. I thought it meant reaching a point where the story no longer hurt when I told it, where memories stopped tightening my chest, where I could think about my past without feeling like something had been stolen from me. But healing doesn't work like that. Healing isn't erasure, it's integration. It's learning how to carry what happened without letting it dictate how you live. That realization took years. At first, I tried to rush myself. I told myself I should be stronger by now, more detached, less affected. I measured my progress against imaginary timelines that had nothing to do with reality. And every time I felt the pain resurface, I judged myself for it. But grief doesn't respond to deadlines. Neither does betrayal. The truth is, what happened didn't just end my marriage, it ended an entire belief system. I had believed that if you loved well, you would be loved well in return. That if you were loyal, loyalty would find its way back to you. That family bonds were unbreakable simply because they shared blood. Losing those beliefs felt like losing innocence. And you don't get innocence back once it's gone. So instead of trying to become the person I was before, I had to become someone new, someone with clearer boundaries, someone who understood that forgiveness and access are not the same thing, someone who no longer confused sacrifice with love. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Who taught you that forgiving someone means continuing to make space for them in your life? Because that idea kept me stuck for a long time. I was encouraged to move on, to be the bigger person, to let go for my own peace. And while those words sound wise, they often ignore a critical truth. Peace requires safety, and safety requires boundaries. I learned that forgiveness is something you do internally, not something you owe externally. I could forgive without reopening wounds. I could release bitterness without inviting harm back into my life. I could choose not to hate without choosing to forget. That distinction saved me. Over time, I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped imagining what I should have said differently. I stopped wishing for apologies that would never come. Not because I got answers, but because I stopped needing them. I realized that closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you decide to live without. And that decision is an act of self-respect. My life grew quieter, not empty, quieter. I filled it with things that grounded me instead of things that distracted me. I chose relationships that felt reciprocal, conversations that felt honest, spaces where I didn't have to explain why my boundaries existed. I learned to trust again, but slowly, deliberately, not the blind trust of before, the kind that listens to intuition, the kind that notices patterns, the kind that doesn't ignore discomfort just to keep the peace. That kind of trust is earned, and so is access to me. Let me ask you something else, especially if you've been hurt deeply. What would your life look like if you stopped demanding explanations from people who've already shown you who they are? That question changed everything for me. I stopped asking why they did what they did. I started asking what I would allow moving forward. That shift gave me back my power. I no longer introduced myself as someone who had been betrayed. I no longer centered my identity around what I lost. I was someone who had loved fully and survived the cost of that love. There's dignity in that. I didn't become hardened. I didn't become suspicious of everyone. I didn't lose my capacity for compassion, but I did become discerning. And discernment is not bitterness, it's wisdom. Now, when I look back, I don't romanticize the woman I was. I honor her. She gave everything she had to something she believed in. She showed up consistently. She built something real. Her mistake wasn't loving deeply. Her mistake was believing that love alone was enough to guarantee respect. And that lesson, painful as it was, reshaped how I live. Let me leave you with one last question, and I hope you answer it in the comments. If you knew loving someone could cost you everything, would you still choose to love the way you do? There's no right answer, but there is an honest one. And honesty with yourself is where healing truly begins. There comes a time, quietly, without ceremony, when you realize your life is no longer defined by what happened to you. Not because it stopped mattering, but because you stopped living inside it. That realization didn't arrive with relief, it arrived with clarity. I noticed it one morning when I woke up and didn't immediately think about them. When my first thought wasn't about betrayal or family fractures or the years I had poured into something that collapsed without warning. I noticed it when I made decisions without wondering how they would be interpreted by people who were no longer part of my life. I noticed it when my body felt calmer. That's how you know healing has taken root. Not when pain disappears, but when it stops controlling your nervous system. I had spent so long being strong for others that I didn't realize how much of my life had been shaped around holding everything together. I had been the reliable one, the accommodating one, the woman who made things work. And for years, that role felt like purpose. But purpose built entirely on sacrifice eventually hollows you out. So I began asking myself different questions. Not, why did this happen to me? But what kind of life do I want now? Not, how do I forgive them? But how do I honor myself? Those questions were harder, but they were honest. I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. I stopped hoping for accountability from people who had already shown me their limits. That wasn't bitterness, that was acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood. People think it means approval. It doesn't. Acceptance simply means you stop demanding reality be different than it is. And that shift freed me. I learned that closure is not a conversation you finally get to have. It's a boundary you finally stop crossing. I also learned something about grief that no one had ever told me. Grief doesn't always soften with time. Sometimes it matures. It becomes quieter, more reflective, less sharp, but it never disappears completely. And that's okay, because grief is not the enemy. It's evidence that something meaningful existed. What matters is what you allow grief to shape in you. For a while, it shaped caution, then wisdom, then compassion, not for the people who betrayed me, but for myself. I stopped criticizing the woman I had been. I stopped calling her naive or foolish. She was loyal. She was committed. She believed in partnership. She believed in family. Those are not weaknesses. They are values. And I refuse to let someone else's betrayal turn my values into liabilities. Let me ask you something, and I hope you'll answer it honestly in the comments. What part of yourself did you almost lose while trying to survive something painful? Because that's the part worth reclaiming. I reclaim my voice. I learned to say no without explaining myself. I learned to walk away without justifying my decision. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of smoothing it over to make others feel better. I also learned that love doesn't require self erasure, that partnership isn't proven through exhaustion, that loyalty does not mean tolerating disrespect. Those lessons didn't make me colder, they made me clearer. Today, my life is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It is grounded. I surround myself with people who know how to show up consistently, who don't require me to shrink to maintain peace, who understand that trust is built through behavior, not promises. I no longer romanticize struggle. I no longer confuse chaos with passion or sacrifice with devotion. Peace has become my standard. And peace, I've learned, is not boring. It's earned. If you're watching this and you're older, if you've lived long enough to know that some betrayals don't come with clean endings, I want you to hear this clearly. Your story does not end where you were hurt. It continues where you decide to live honestly again. You don't owe anyone access to you just because they share history, blood, or time. You owe yourself integrity. Let me ask you one final question, and this one matters deeply. If you stopped carrying what was never yours to carry, who would you become? Sit with that, because the answer isn't about revenge or reconciliation. It's about freedom. This isn't a story about bitterness. It's a story about a woman who loved deeply, lost painfully, and chose to live with dignity anyway. And if you're still here, still listening, still reflecting, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what did this story bring up for you? Some stories don't end with justice, but they can end with truth. And sometimes that's enough.